Hi everyone, and welcome to D&D Horror Stories with D&D Doge. In today's video, we have a story about a group of D&D players that get an NPC's name wrong, and the Dungeon Master accuses them of transphobia. A story about a DM that makes a player an Oathbreaker in the first game of a campaign, and much more. So without further ado, let's get into some D&D horror stories. My Dungeon Master retconned my character into being a transphobe. By Reddit user, JustTile. Hey RPG Horror Stories, I'm here with a classic case of DM overreach. Let's set the stage. So, we're fresh into this pirate-themed Pathfinder game, and kick things off aboard the Wormwood. Early on, we meet this grizzled NPC pirate, and he introduces himself as Jack Scrimshaw. At least, that's what we eventually learned. You see, in our first conversation with him, we all collectively misheard his name as Jax Grimshaw. None of us caught it, and the Dungeon Master did not correct us, so our party just assumed Jax was this quirky pirate's actual name. It was kind of charming, and we thought it fit the setting. For 3 entire sessions, we were calling this dude Jax. The Dungeon Master seems annoyed whenever we say it, but he doesn't correct us in character. We just figure that that's the DM's way of showing that the NPC is a grouchy old hermit or something, so we keep on calling him Jax. Fast forward to the 4th session. The Dungeon Master stops us mid-conversation and says, "Actually, his name is Jack Scrimshaw." We all laugh it off and make jokes about how we got his name wrong and it's actually Jack, singular. But suddenly, the DM gives us this weird look and says, "You know, Jack doesn't appreciate you using that name. Jax is his dead name. Calling him that is actually pretty offensive." The DM explains that, according to this new backstory, calling him Jax is essentially a hate crime in the campaign. We're all sitting there like, wait, what? Because 1, this was never mentioned in the beginning. 2, it came out of absolutely nowhere. And 3, we didn't even know we were doing anything wrong. The worst part is that the DM starts acting like our characters are in the wrong, and implies we're being transphobic out of character for calling him Jax. One of the players tries to clarify by saying, "Look, we thought that was his name, and we're sorry for any misunderstanding, but this is the first we're hearing of any of this." But the DM just stares us down, saying something like, "You should have known better. Jack has been through a lot, and to him, it feels like a blatant attack on his identity." We're all kind of stunned, but the DM doubles down, saying our characters are now on, quote, "thin ice" with Jack. So now, not only does Jack hate us, but the DM keeps throwing shade whenever we interact with him, making snide comments about our, quote, "problematic behavior." At this point, it's clear that he expects us to grovel to this NPC, but honestly, none of us can take it seriously after how forced it felt. The whole thing has become this weird, passive-aggressive meta lesson about respecting NPCs' identities. We haven't played in 2 weeks now, and I'm honestly considering leaving the group. TLDR. Misheard an NPC's name as Jax. The DM decides that's actually his dead name, and accuses us of in-character and out-of-character transphobia for saying it. Holy cow, talk about making a mountain out of a molehill. It was simply a miscommunication that the DM didn't correct right away, and if all the players heard it as Jax, then it's most likely that the DM misspoke. But to then make it a whole thing about the group being, quote, transphobes came absolutely out of nowhere and doesn't make any sense, as the party just got the name wrong. It's not like they even referred to this character as the wrong gender or anything like that. This dungeon master is reaching here, and is likely using this as a way to deflect that they probably made the initial mistake of calling this NPC by the wrong name first. I would say to talk to the DM about how this whole deal with him calling everyone transphobic doesn't make any sense, but as OP said, another player already tried to explain that to them. OP could always stay and see if the whole thing is forgotten about after a few sessions, but honestly, if the DM held on to this for that long and threw out that accusation because of it, I may have to lean with OP's decision to possibly leave the game, as who knows what else could cause this DM to suddenly become passive-aggressive like that. Though, what are your thoughts on this one? Let's move on. Dungeon Master plays online chess mid-game by Reddit user Lady Firelight. You ever find yourself in a situation so out of the realm of your experience that you find you're paralyzed to do anything but let it wash over you? Several years ago, my then best friend invited me to a D&D 5th edition game that her spouse was going to run in their home with some of their friends that I'd barely met. I had played with her for a couple of years, trusted her judgment on his skill level and their friends, and agreed to join. Red flags from the start, which continued over the 5 or 6 games that I played in. The house smelled and looked like a dumpster, like not having cleaned anything for months level of filth. One of the other players was a heavy smoker. He tried to accommodate my breathing and headache issues by not smoking during games, which was very kind, and I told him so. But he still smelled so strongly that it was miserable for me. My friend said it was okay for me to come over a few minutes early each week to set up my seat, as I need disability accessibility. A couple weeks into this, and my friend asks me, "Why are you here now?" with an expression like I was the most inconvenient thing that had ever happened to her. The other players often showed up as much as an hour late, which, in hindsight, is probably the reason for the previous question from my friend. But again, I was unfamiliar with the other players and thought it was a fluke. The Dungeon Master only prepped for about 5 minutes immediately before each game. I asked, sometimes as all of us players waited. I know some DMs can do that, but he was not one of them. This would lead to sometimes upwards of an hour with us players twiddling our thumbs mid-game, waiting for him to be ready to continue. His DMing style was also so utterly forgettably boring. And then the last night. No preamble. About an hour into our game, the Dungeon Master turns on the wall-sized TV in the room and starts showing us piano tutorials. The other players vaguely responded, but also clearly wanted to get back to the game. Then, the DM started up his online chess game and started playing. The room went silent. He continued to play. I can't even tell you how long, because I kind of blue screened. I think I disassociated the rest of the night, then politely tapped out of the game a few days later. No game is better than any of that. Jeez, talk about a nightmare of a gaming environment. First with the dirty house, and OP's friend acting angry when OP showed up early, when they knew that OP needed special accommodations. Then, for the players to show up late, the DM not doing any prep and thus starting late, and then the DM just showing YouTube videos and playing online chess while he was supposed to be running the game. I don't blame OP for leaving that game at all. No D&D is better than bad D&D, but that already sounded like no D&D. On to the next one. Am I the a-hole for counterspelling another player's fireball? By Reddit user Potato271. So I've been playing D&D with a bunch of friends and friends of friends for a while, and our party is currently working for this local lord. Everything was going fine. We were all having fun. Last session, we were rescuing a bunch of hostages from a bandit gang. The aim was to do it stealthily without battle, but the rogue got seen and it quickly became a fight. So we now have a battle in the middle of this camp with a bunch of NPC villagers trying to run away at the same time, which makes it a lot harder because we can't really use AoEs. It isn't going great, and eventually our sorcerer decides to just chuck a fireball in, regardless of the fact that it will almost certainly kill most of the people we were trying to save. To be frank, the character is true neutral, and it more or less tracks that he'd go for the easy option, even if it's not necessarily the right thing to do. His logic is, he thinks we're losing the fight, and that a dead party will not save anyone, whereas nuking the bad guys allows at least some of the hostages to escape. However, I decided that killing off the hostages and pissing off our patron lord is a really bad idea, so I counterspell the fireball, as I'm playing a chaotic good Archfey Warlock. This really pisses off the sorcerer's player, but we keep going and eventually win the battle with only a few casualties, although we have to burn quite a few resources to do so. But after the session, we get into an argument with about half the table taking each side. Sorcerer's player reckons that you should never counterspell another player's action, as that's basically PvP, whereas I think that it was the appropriate thing to do at that moment. To be clear, this is a no PvP table, where we have kicked out a guy who repeatedly tried to screw over other players, but I feel like this was the right thing to do for the party. So, am I in the wrong here? The Dungeon Master reckons what I did was fine, but a couple of the other players disagree. Yeah, this is a pretty tricky one, but I don't think OP is the a-hole. He was playing his character the way the character would be, and so was the other player. I can kinda see both sides of this, but in the end, it is the Dungeon Master's call, and the Dungeon Master agrees that OP didn't do anything wrong. Though I am curious, what do you all think on this one? Was OP in the right to counterspell the fireball to save the hostages? Or did he overstep a boundary? I would love to know your opinions. And I would also love that, if you're enjoying the video, that you crit the like button and subscribe if you haven't already done so. And so would Simba. But with that said, let's get to the next post. That Breaks Your Oath by Reddit user The Jolly Hamster. I'm pretty sure there are a ton of stories like mine out there, but honestly, it still infuriates me just writing this. I'm a forever DM, hooray, ever since I picked up the habit a few years ago. Most people around me don't want to, or just aren't interested in DMing, which is fine, to each their own. But only ever being the DM can be a bit frustrating. I want to experience what it's like to be a player, with all the fun that comes with it. So I made probably the dumbest decision possible. I looked online for a group where I could play. Yes, it's the subreddit you're thinking of. Anyway, I found a post that seemed interesting enough. Dark, gritty story vibes, which is actually right up my alley. I could never quite pull that off as a DM, but as a player, I don't think it would be a problem. Getting into the group was a bit of a process, I guess because so many people want to be players. But I managed to slip through the cracks and got invited, which was awesome. The DM held a session 0 where he told me and 3 others the kind of game he wanted to run, and we went over our boundaries for what we were cool with and what we weren't. Then we moved on to character creation. he asked us to make characters that weren't necessarily the usual types, something to shake things up and surprise him. We were starting at level 3, so I figured it would be cool to roll up a paladin. Yeah, I know, a bit standard, but I thought the Oath of Conquest would really suit the vibe that he wanted. I checked with him and the others to see if they would be okay with that. They were, as long as my character was neutral or good, which was what I had in mind anyway. Sure, it's tricky with Conquest, but it can be done. So session day finally comes, and we all meet up. It started off great. We were hired by a caravan to escort their goods across the continent. We chatted a bit to get to know each other's characters, and then we were ambushed by a band of gnolls. It's a pretty classic setup, and honestly, a solid way to introduce a bit of everything in the first session. But that's where the problems began. As soon as the gnolls attacked, the caravan leader told our group, remember, hired mercenaries, "Kill the creatures, our cargo must be protected," or something along those lines. So naturally, we moved to protect the cargo and take down the threat. When it was my turn, I had my character move up to deal with a gnoll. That's when the DM goes, "You're just going to do what he told you?" I was a bit confused, but maybe there was some hidden meaning there. So I said, "Yeah, I mean, that's what we were paid to do." Then, out of nowhere, the DM says, "Well, then you're breaking your oath. You'll become an Oathbreaker now." Which, look, I'm not the most experienced DM, but what? My clueless self even tried to argue, saying, "No, it doesn't." The DM replied with, "Yeah, your conquest. Your tenet says you have to rule. You can't take orders. You're gonna be an Oathbreaker going forward." You can guess how the session went off the rails from there. Honestly, it was infuriating. First, that's not how that works. And second, this was the first bloody session. Who in the nine hells turns a paladin into an Oathbreaker on the very first session? Well, I'm no one's doormat. So yeah, you bet your sweet gold coins, I walked. The DM would not hear me out or budge on the subject. So no D&D was better than dealing with that nonsense. Though it really sucked, because I was genuinely excited to finally play as a character. Honestly, I still think this all happened because he just didn't want an Oath of Conquest in his game. And that's totally fine. Just tell me up front. I would have happily made a different character. Maybe not exactly a horror story, but still. Ugh. TLDR. The DM turned my Oath of Conquest paladin into an Oathbreaker in the first session, just because my character listened to the NPC who'd paid him to be a mercenary. Yeah, that is a bit of a ridiculous call for that DM to make. I mean, sure, Oath of Conquests says to rule with an iron fist, but it also states, quote, "once you conquered." The character needs to get to a place of power first. Simply attacking the gnolls that were attacking their caravan because OP's character was hired as a mercenary should not make the character an Oathbreaker. I think OP might be right in thinking that the DM just did not want an Oath of Conquest paladin in the game. And like OP said, if that was the case, why not just say no to it? So yeah, that was a BS call. And I don't blame OP for seeing the writing on the wall and noping out of the game. Here's hoping that OP can find another game to play in and break the curse of Forever DM. On to the next post. I left after one session because the Dungeon Master made my character impossible to play. By Reddit user QuirkyKish789. A couple of years ago, me and a couple of friends from high school started a D&D campaign. I was the Dungeon Master, and ran it for a little bit before family stuff came up, which led to me not being allowed to play anymore. The short version is that my parents, very religious, had a quote change of heart after originally being okay with me playing, and claimed to have received a message from God that D&D was satanic or something along those lines. Anyways, the story starts with me and my friends now starving for a D&D campaign, looking for someone else to be Dungeon Master. We found April, a fake name, who had been playing a bit longer than we had and had offered to run a campaign for us. The only thing we were told is that we started at level 10, and I created my character along with everyone else. The first session opens with all of our characters escaping from the captivity of an unknown militia, and everything seems to be going smoothly until someone casts a spell. After the spell resolves, April announces that everyone has a level of exhaustion. I asked if this was an effect of a disease or poison of some kind. I was playing a land druid, and was told that this is just how the magic system works in our setting. There are no spell slots, but everyone shares a pool of magical energy, and whenever that pool is running low, determined at the DM's discretion, everyone gets a level of exhaustion. We were told to use our spells sparingly, or there would be consequences. This was never discussed prior to our character creation. There was never a session 0, so there was no way for us to be prepared for this, let alone create realistic characters in this setting. Not to mention that our party consisted of my character, a land druid as previously mentioned, a wild magic sorcerer, an evocation wizard, a battlemaster fighter, and a knowledge domain cleric. For those of you who don't know, this is mostly a party of full casters who rely very heavily on their spells. Needless to say, I faked an excuse to leave and never came back to session 2. I do still play with my original group though, just not April. And I've heard horror stories from how that campaign went, as they all stayed through the whole campaign. From what I gathered, the wizard pulled a rather enthusiastic sacrifice himself move so they could do a ranger build instead. The sorcerer used strictly a heavy crossbow, and the cleric had to multi-class into a paladin. Well, first off, I feel like OP kinda glossed over their parents forbidding D&D because they got a message from God. That is just nuts. But as far as April making magic having to be a shared pool between players that would cause negative effects when they would use spells for a party mainly consisting of spellcasters kinda breaks the game, and effectively makes playing a caster kind of a headache. I'm not sure what that DM was thinking. Maybe she thought she was revolutionizing D&D or something. But in any case, I would have probably left that game as well. But I think OP should have told April why they were leaving. That way, maybe she would have rethought her magic system in the game, and OP could have stayed. But at least it sounds like OP still played with their normal group, but just behind their parents' back, I would imagine. But that is all I have for you today. As always, I appreciate all of you, and may your games remain horror story free. Until next time.